Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming back for part B of the session on advancing gender and youth inclusion in the AfCFTA. So basically, maybe we can term this session like as economics as if everybody matters. Because women and youth and everyone else who's marginalized, they actually matter. When we talk about economics, when we talk about industrial policy, and we're just talking about anything really. So we have our amazing speakers. I don't see the other one, so I don't know where he is, but he'll probably maybe join us in a few minutes. So we have our first presentation from Penny Parenzee. Their presentation is titled Reflecting on the Implementation of the AfCFTA Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade, Focus on Sustainable Industrialization and Inclusive Growth. Let's give Penny a hand.
Well, it's less intimidating because there's so few people in the room, so I think that's a good one. So good afternoon, everyone. It's nothing worse than the last session of the day where you've had lots of speaking at you. My name is Penny Parenzee. I'm part of the team at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. My wonderful colleague who's sitting in front here, Agisanang Mahua, is the one who also worked with me on this paper. So I've been, I think, designated responsibility for sharing because I don't know who's more nervous to present between the two of us, but I had the short end of the stick. But the views I share are our cumulative thinking that we've applied to this. So in the earlier session, there was quite a bit of talk about already the AfCFTA protocol, the AfCFTA agreement broadly, and then the protocol on women and youth. And there's quite a bit of background given, where there was acknowledgement that, you know, this agreement that we have now has built on a history of other attempts at regional integration that have had sort of tempered impact, right? And there's always a sense of we've not quite yet fulfilled that vision that we've wanted. And the AfCFTA is sort of an agreement which is recapturing and sort of that vision of wanting a united continent, of wanting to build a thriving continent, of wanting to see development where on the continent we work as one. And so I want to just highlight, sorry, I'm going to go to your slide and I just want to see where I am. Just because in the earlier session, what happened was there was a lot of talk on the women and not about women and youth. And the AfCFTA protocol on women and youth, just to give it some context, that in addition to recognizing that the realities we face is that there's limited inter-Africa trade, you've seen it in different sessions today where people have spelt the numbers. Given the numbers. There's also been a recognition that there's a change in our global trade environment. We see what's happening with the US. We see tariffs that are being slapped on and African countries suffering. You look at the kind of impact it's had on Lesotho, who's had 50% tariff placed on it. But in addition to that, you have this economic marginalization of women and youth. And so some stats that was drawn from sort of the African Development Bank, from the ILO, from Afrobarometer and other writers talk about 72 million African youth are not in employment, education or training, of whom 2/3 are women. That 12 million young people enter the job market annually, yet only 3.1 million jobs are available. Women's labor force participation is lower than that of men's. We spoke about earlier in the session about the high rates of women involved in informal employment. And then over and above the economic marginalization, the complexity of marginalization being exacerbated as a consequence of socio-political and environmental factors. And you've heard a few speakers, for those who were in the room in this session earlier, talk about sort of the extent of violence, of harassment, a lot spoke about, but also there's stats that talk about 20% of women aged 15 to 49 are subjected to physical or sexual violence. In 2022, 8.9 million young people were living near conflicts. And so, you know, I'm sharing this also in the context of climate change. Those who are most bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change would be women and youth. So all these contextual realities are important to bear in mind because the AfCFTA and the protocol on women and youth have to operate in this environment. So I wanted to just sort of reiterate that point. And so when we looked at the protocol of women and youth, it's really a response to these specific challenges that relate to women and youth in trade, right? And so the information that's been out there is that as the protocol, once it was endorsement that there should be this protocol to the AfCFTA, there was a series of consultations that were held with women and then with youth across the continent. And to sort of get to the crux of what are the challenges that are confronting women and youth. And what came out was some of what you can see on the slide, which others have mentioned earlier today as well. The issues around tariff and non-tariff barriers, the complicated trading regimes, oftentimes where people say there's illogical taxes on goods that doesn't make sense. The lack of access to markets, lack of access to finance, transport limitations due to infrastructure and access. And then specifically, with youth was the skills gap, the mismatch between skills young people acquire and those demanded by employers, and then not enough jobs. And even then, when there's work, it's predominantly informal or self-employment, and there's very little protection. So there are all those vulnerabilities that sort of arise. So what we did is we started to think, this is Achisanang and I, we were thinking and we were saying, you know what? How do we ensure that this AfCFTA and this protocol is actually a different kind of agreement, a different kind, something new? It's not the usual. And the questions we asked with, is it possible that the AfCFTA can shift structural power imbalances and address the inequalities in trade, especially when you consider it was mentioned in the keynote address, that it's premised on notions that's sort of largely still based on neoliberal prescripts, right? So there's the notion of comparative advantage, for example. So if that is the case, how does this vision of the AfCFTA of structural transformation, how do we attain that? Also, when you see at a national level, for most African countries, our macroeconomic policies are pretty much still governed and informed by measures of austerity. It looks at privatization, and it looks at trade liberalization that favors global actors. So how in those situations do we actually see, are we able to leverage opportunities with the AfCFTA, knowing that there are sort of those issues that continue to hang over us? And what we then employed was we went and said, look, let's try a feminist analysis because it goes to the heart of power. And so if you look at feminist thinking on the continent, which is always tried to explain marginalization as women and young people and young women experience it on the continent, what are some of the questions we grapple with? And for ourselves, it was, is it possible for the AfCFTA protocol on women and youth in trade to be any different from previous efforts to address experience of marginalization? Can the protocol challenge the embedded power imbalances rather than resort to mere number counting, where we say we've got this tool and we count how many women, how many youth, and think that's fine? How do we ensure that the protocol does not fall foul of co-opting the right language, yet we fail to shift any system of domination? And how do we ensure that this vision of the AfCFTA is not lost in the pragmatism with which the protocol on women and on women and youth in trade is sort of couched? Because there's a lot of technical steps, right? You do this is how you fix this. It's technical. It's sort of regulations, and that can hide because it's providing one surface layer of intervention, but it's not shifting anything fundamental. And so with that in mind, we then started saying, look, what are some of the underlying assumptions when we look at this protocol on women and youth? And a few of them came up in the conversation earlier. The one which came up was this thing around trade, the issue of trade liberalization, right? So there's an assumption, right? So trade liberalization, as far as we're concerned, is a neoliberal policy prescript. You see it in WTO as well. Instead, it's around opening Africa to other global markets. For the AfCFTA, it's saying opening Africa to other countries on the continent. And so the assumption is that we're reducing trade barriers. If it reduces trade barriers to allow ease of access, affordability, and efficiency in cross-border trade. But that works for established sectors, right? So if you in Ethiopia and you are where lots of women are found in the clothing, textile, apparel sector in Ethiopia. It's a well-established sector. There's got huge manufacturing capability. If you open up markets to other African countries, yes, those that sector can thrive, right? Because you can be competitive. But if you in Ghana, and that sector is only new, there's not an equal footing. So in fact, because you're only being newly established, you don't have a competitive edge when there are these within that the price points that are now opened. And so there are unintended consequences of job losses, weakening of local industries, and actual fact, you see intensified inequalities. And if it's in sectors where it's predominantly women and young people, you have job losses. That has a knock-on effect. Why? Because the work that women and young people are predominantly in is informal, it's low paid, it's low skilled, it's precarious. So the impact on your households also great because you've lost, you're losing income. It has that ripple effect. You're in countries where the macroeconomic policy framework pushes austerity, which means social protection networks aren't there. So you end up creating the cycle where people are trapped. And so the question we then ask is for an implementation. So our stance is the AfCFTA and the protocol is something positive. There's opportunity. But if we want to drive an implementation, that knowing the challenges we have in this context, what are questions we need to frame to help us think about how we approach implementation? So questions we asked was, for the implementation agenda of the AfCFTA, how do we ensure it prioritizes interventions that can mitigate disproportionate impact of trade liberalization and safeguard against positioning women to provide cheap labor? And we raise this question because we say rather engage with it and think about the shape and the strategy of the intervention you have when you want to implement it. The other policy prescript we raise as an assumption links to the formalization of cross-border trade. And it came out in this room earlier. The assumption is that formalization will provide the necessary protection against discrimination that women informal traders and workers confront and enable ease of access to trade. There's also an assumption that informalization has a lot of unstructured activities and that as a consequence of cumbersome official regulations, right? So that's the assumption. That's why there's informalization. There's a lot of regulations. It's too much for people to handle. So, there's forms to fill out. People don't always understand, that aren't always literate, can't read. So that is why they're informal. Those are the assumptions. But when we look at informalization, there's been a history of informalization on the continent, which dates back to colonial times. And so there's an argument that it's so entrenched, it's not going anywhere. And so even but the preference
you have 5 minutes.
Is this push. Oh, you can't do that. This preference is the push to move from informalization to formalization. We see it in Article 15 in the Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade. So we're saying, maybe let's move away from that dichotomy. Let's not have this either or debate. Is a question to ask again, implementation of the AfCFTA should move beyond formal-informal dichotomy, and instead focus should be on how structural transformation can address policies, conditions, and institutions that facilitate precarity in the formal as well as in the informal economy. So it's not the either or. I will raise one more, the other two quickly, because I will have liberty because you ran late. The one is around regulating against harassment and related issues, which is in the protocol. In that, the assumption is that women in trade have some level of power to assert or demand recourse when they're subjected to some form of violence, be it sexual violence, be it physical violence, be it harassment. Yet we know in Article 16, in fact, of the protocol, what's put in place to deal with harassment is a redress mechanisms, grievance redress mechanisms, and then mechanisms to prevent, discourage, address, and eliminate harassment. But we know that women involved in trade are predominantly in the informal sector. Their positions are precarious. So that if they fear any further violence, they fear anything that can bring retaliation, which means they jeopardize the opportunity to get the income, which is subsistence level income. And so that all renders you powerless. But yet the response is saying, assuming that you have power. So the question then again, what we propose we need to engage with is not just think of distributional inequalities, but remember the relational inequalities, those sort of social prescripts of hierarchies of power, and how that acts with the distributional inequalities and sort of creates this this dynamic where you're actually locked. And how do we think about this when we're trying to actually deal with issues of violence? And then the last is the provocation, and then I'm going to end with 2 sentences, I promise, is entrepreneurship. When it comes to youth, the assumption is that the trajectory for young people to meaningfully participate in trade is as an entrepreneur. But our view is that young people contribute in diverse ways. They have different skills, they have different capabilities, they have different innovations and energies. Why are we locking and saying that the answer to our youth unemployment issue is entrepreneurship, when it's actually only one small component? And should we not be thinking broader? And so when we want to consider inclusivity of Africa's young people, can we maybe move beyond entrepreneurship and think about ways in which to actually tap into the diverse ways in which they can be part of a broader trade ecosystem? So that's the last provocation. And then, you know, we just the view we also have, and I keep saying we because Achim mustn't leave me alone here to be shouted at, that the AfCFTA as a new type of trade agreement, it needs to be responsive to underlying structural dimensions of social and economic inequality that women and youth confront. This is going to require fundamental disruptions of power. And often when we think fundamental disruptions of power, we think Africa and the globe, or we think these power differences within countries in Africa, but also how people are relating based on these hierarchies that we have in a society. And so those are things we need to think about. And, you know, to fulfill this vision, which I think is a fantastic vision that is encaptured in the AfCFTA, we're going to need bold actions. And if we look at the state of our governance in many of our countries, and we've seen it through the uprising of young people in Kenya we've seen it in Nigeria, we've seen it in Sudan, when there's been a dissatisfaction because there's violations of rights. There's a sense that your needs are not being met because your inequality is deepening, poverty is deepening, unemployment remains. You can't leave change to just people and a system that's not working with you. So things we need to do is not only think about broadening the vision of youth in trade beyond entrepreneurship, but we need to think about how do we start building solidarity? How do young women and men start coming together and building solidarity? So that when we're implementing the AfCFTA, it's an AfCFTA that's implemented in a way that's responsive to our needs. And that solidarity can't just be in our silos. It's got to be across countries, across the continent, and even global. And so I'll leave that with you, and thank you very much. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny and Arisenang. I like how you highlighted that the powerlessness of women in the household actually gets amplified in the markets outside the home. So we shouldn't just assume that now that they're outside of the home, that women now all of a sudden have power. So we have our second speaker who will also talk about taking pictures. Women and youth. And his presentation is on leveraging AfCFTA for industrial development in Uganda, harnessing the youth demographic dividend. Take it away, Emolot.
You know, after Professor, I think we should baptize you Professor, because after you, I don't think I need even to say anything else. I feel I already had the solidarity to just sit there and just go with that paper back home. But anyhow, thank you so much, colleagues. My name is Emolot, Allan David, and I do chair the Independent Continental Youth Advisory Council on the AfCFTA, or commonly known as ICOYACA, or other people know it as the AfCFTA Youth Advisory Council. And what we mainly do is champion meaningful youth engagement in the AfCFTA implementation process. So today, I'm just going to share an interesting research that I did, mainly looking at the demographic dividend. And I used Uganda, but it's across the African continent that the young people are the biggest majority in most of the African countries. But why Uganda? Not that I'm Ugandan, but because Uganda is, I think, the second or the second youngest country in the world. Second youngest country in the world, if I'm not mistaken, and also mainly looking at also the rate at which young people are growing. So that's why I was looking at how can we then use the AfCFTA beyond me championing the trade at the regional level. What other thing can we use the AfCFTA for? And that's what I was thinking. It's this vehicle that the AU member states have put in place to champion, to get our people leap out of poverty. So what is it? What do we need to do? And that is what we are trying to address in this. Yes, so Uganda, as I've mentioned, 75% are young people, very young, dynamic people. You may see, but unfortunately, the unemployment rate in Uganda is about 13 and above, over 700,000. 700,000 young people enter the job market almost every year. So how are we going to be able to absorb that number? They enter the job market every year. So, but what do we have? We have here the AfCFTA, a 3.4 trillion market created by this amazing instrument that the African Union put in place. And of course, we will then be able to explore. But in between there, you can see what I'm talking about. 22.7% are young people. The census was done recently. We're about 45, but people say others were not counted. So we're about 50 million young people. 50 million people in the country. And in that, the workforce alone, between 14 to 64, people are still working, is 55% of the total population. That number there needs to be harnessed. And what needs to be done? That's where we have the AfCFTA here. And mainly, what are we looking at here? If you see that when I was doing my research, the bigger percentage, and this is across most of the African countries, in Uganda, 83.5 to 93.5 youth are in informal employment, and there are those in the net. The net, mainly for those who don't know, is not in employment, education, or training. Most of them are 20 to 25%, and this cuts across most African countries. So maybe what are the challenges that I found out? Over-reliance on low productivity, agriculture. Uganda, 70% of the economy is run by agriculture, and that is what is causing unemployment. The gender, a doctor was here talking about the gender, the women. That is just a big issue in Uganda. So over 20% our women are also unemployed. They're contributing to the unemployment rates. Then, of course, the regional disparities and, of course, the skills mismatch, which is something that I also found out in the field. And the impact, usually what we are dealing with in the country is a social unrest. For those who have been following East African crisis, you see Kenyan youth are rioting, Uganda, you go to the Tanzanians are unhappy, mainly because of the poverty. And yet we have something that is quite amazing here. Okay, so what are the opportunities? I found out that when we fully roll out the AfCFTA in the country, over 100,000 to 180,000 jobs will be created just rolling out. And where is it? In agro-processing, manufacturing, and of course the digital services. If you had at the keynote address, Dr. Makong was talking about the key sectors, and agro-processing is one of them. And in East Africa, the food basket, more or less, Uganda being actually the food basket of East Africa, most of the young people are engaged in informal agriculture. But how can we use that to then take advantage of the AfCFTA? And of course, the key sectors they can take advantage of, we have agro-processing, as I've said, we have manufacturing, the textile, the electronics. Of course, we have the digital services. East African young people now know how to fight. The solidarity doctor was talking about, they have solidarity through their phones. they can cause the whole president to come on Twitter to address their issues. So if that solidarity can be used for the betterment of their own lives, that is something. So the digital divide needs to also be, the digital services need to be harnessed. Okay, but the barriers we are talking about, what are those barriers? The skills mismatch. I found out that only 1.5% of youth access relevant training in Uganda, 1.5, and which is the biggest issue that is currently hindering them from fully taking advantage of the AfCFTA opportunities. Number two, of course, infrastructure deficit. This has been the song from the presentations in the morning. Infrastructure, inadequate transport and digital connectivity. The connectivity we are talking about, data rates are still very high for our young people who are in digital commerce or e-commerce. Very expensive. You buy 1 GB, you post 2-3 dresses, those in Instagram, your data is over. Most of them cannot afford the home connectivities and other services. So data, which is affecting digital connectivity. The low awareness. Yes, we are talking about the AfCFTA, but I bet you in that room, most of the people, some of them were hearing it for the first time, what the AfCFTA is. So if the policymakers, those who have the knowledge, are hearing it for the first time, what about the many young entrepreneurs who are out there who are hoping to become the next Dangote of South Africa? How will they get to know that there's an opportunity called the AfCFTA? Then, of course, the policy gaps. In Uganda, I found that corruption and urban biases. Most of the interventions are mainly localized within the urban centers. But you go up country, they don't even know that there is even a TVET somewhere that they can go and enroll and get a skill. So the question is, what's holding Uganda back from seizing the AfCFTA opportunity? This is not only for Uganda. What is holding your country back, where you come from? Probably that would also be something you would also go back and interrogate. Okay, so what are the current policies that Uganda has? Uganda has something called the Youth Livelihood Program, which is being affected by repayment. So it's a kind of a loan that government gives, but repayment is an issue in the country. Young people take the loans but don't pay. But it would have helped. 30% of funds misallocation. Government just decides to put money wherever they decide to put money, and they miss a lot on that. Then, of course, this TVET, this the business training, vocational education, the business technology. Yes, the business technical vocational educational training, BTVET. The country has put most of them around the country. The government has put most of them around the country. But what is the challenge? They are not aligned with the AfCFTA market. Whatever they are teaching, how they are teaching the young entrepreneurs to do value addition is not in line with the market. And yet the AfCFTA requires a certain standard for them to be to of course hit the market. So we have the national youth policy that is also lacks focus on trade. And we have an interesting one that was recently launched, the parish development model, where government invests about, you can imagine, $300 to a parish that can have maybe a population of about maybe 800,000 people. You're giving them $300. Those who have to go and get a loan, that is very little money for someone to actually be able to make sense of it. And it's a good model, not bad, but it's one that is having issues. Of course, systematic corruption is still an issue. Okay. What are some of the proposed interventions that I actually suggested to ensure that Uganda leverages this? Number one, I said vocational training reforms. We need to then be able to reform the vocational trainings to suit the AfCFTA demands, the agro-processing, the digital, all that. We need to do that. Then the National AfCFTA Task Force talked about solidarity. You cannot talk about solidarity without a vehicle to enable that solidarity. And now currently, that's why we are championing national AfCFTA youth committees at every member state level to give us that solidarity, to ensure that they become that vehicle. Then, of course, climate resilient trainings, because of, we have floods today, tomorrow you have the rain. The ever-changing weather patterns is also affecting. Youth cooperatives, a very good model is in Kenya. But cooperatives, why cooperatives is just an interesting, it helps aggregate. If we are to do the AfCFTA, you need to do bulk bulk exports. But bulk exports is also costly. So what do? You come as a group of young people dealing in pineapples, come together, get a container and ship. So cooperatives have been very successful in Kenya. And unfortunately, most governments are phasing off cooperatives, but it would be something that we should be able to revive for young people to also be able to export in bulk. Then, of course, digital hubs, very important. Now it's a digital age. We need to have governments and private partners need to also ensure that we have these digital hubs to ensure. Then, of course, lastly, awareness campaigns, youth-friendly awareness campaigns, TikTok, YouTube. We are seeing most of them are on Instagram. So that's where we all need to go. In 5 minutes. Where am I now? Okay. Even oh, thank you. I don't know. I can't see my title there. But policy, I believe that is some policy recommendations on infrastructure investment. This is mainly for government. Private sectors can't do mega investments on infrastructure. Then gender inclusive trainings. This is very, very important. Why? Because close to 70% of informal cross-border trade is done by women. And the doctor here was also telling you the challenges women actually face, or even the fears that is making them lose money. So if they have these trainings, which are very gender inclusive trainings, it is very important. It's very important for them to then be able to navigate the market, especially cross-border. And hopefully, if research can be done around cross-border gender violence or sexual harassment around cross-border points, is also something that is hindering our young girls to cross the border with their goods and services, because there is what we call sex for trade that is very silent around borders. These open porous borders between South Africa and Zimbabwe and Botswana, these challenges are there, but no one talks about them. But if research can be done, it could help. But gender inclusive training is important for even custom officers. Then governance reforms. We also need to be able to do digital related reforms. And mainly this governance is on data. Data, I would want advocacy also around data. So that data is cheap for our people. Elon Musk shouldn't be stopped to come to South Africa to sell his internet, which probably may be cheap, or even if it's not cheap, it can reach the rural part of South Africa, where someone actually has a tomato, take a picture and post, and someone in Joburg here can go to that place. But they need that internet. And those are some of the regulations we need to deal with. Then, of course, adapting regional models. Rwanda has it, the trade portal. Nigeria has it, the textile cluster. Very important. I think UNODC, not UNODC, it's one of the UN entities, I've forgotten the names, has a very good model. They implemented it in clustering in Ghana, where they went to Western Ghana and clustered a few entrepreneurs, and it worked very well. So as I conclude, I think I need to, okay, CASA is not moving, but just back. Yes, expected impact for Uganda, of course, when they fully implement 150 jobs, I said, economic growth, transforming demographic dividend into drivers of prosperity, which we think we can still achieve. Social stability. We will be able to reduce these ones in non-employment, education, and training. The rates will drop and the regional disparities if the AfCFTA can be implemented. And then, of course, it will position Uganda as a leader in the AfCFTA space. What else do I have to say here? Next slide, second last, I believe. It's not working. Okay. Yeah, so AfCFTA is there, very historical instrument. And I think why I also began championing it is because I come from a cross-border family, trade. My parents are cross-border traders. They used to, now they are retired, between Malaba, Uganda and Malaba, Kenya. So I know the benefits of trading with one another. And that's why when this opportunity came, I began advocating for it without even clear grounds on how the AU was going to engage young people. But we set the pace for that because we believe the AfCFTA can unlock business opportunities for our young people. And of course, for Uganda, that is possible. But for our policymakers, we believe that definitely if we work together, the solidarity doctor is talking about, we definitely will be able to ensure that we achieve what we achieve. So I am a big advocate for peace and security too, but through trade. I definitely believe trade is, intra-African trade is equal to peace and security. if we trade with one another, there will be no need. You know, the issues why we have this violence and whatnot is because I don't see the benefit of trading with her. What is she going to give me? But if I know I'm taking textile to you and you're giving me money, if I know I'm taking tomatoes the other side and I'm picking money from there, definitely there will the rate at which we shall be able to fight or to get into even any ruckus is hard. And last year we did a project on building bridges initiative, and the core central point of that project was, what language do traders speak? They go to war-torn areas and actually are able to trade. So why can't we harness that power to make them peace ambassadors? And that really is what I believe, that intra-African trade is equals to peace and security. Asanteni sana.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I guess we can all agree that those were excellent presentations. And like I said at the beginning, that basically we could term this session as doing industrial policy as if everybody mattered. And by everybody and by everyone, I mean including those who are marginalized. And we have identified those individuals as women and the youth. Just to add, while I was, after reading the papers and just like supplementing some of the information, I came across an article by the World Economic Forum where they mentioned that by 2030, young people in Africa will constitute 42% of the global population. So these conversations are very important, and also ensuring that these conversations are grounded in reality. So now we'll have a Q&A session, about 15 minutes. So if you guys have any questions, so we have one hand there. And Gelelo, do we have any questions online? Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Unfortunately, I think I missed half of yours. Baptized professor, did not get your name, but so my questions are to you, Mr. Asante. So with Uganda's agri-employment being at 70%, at what rate are people being upskilled to be able to enter the agri-processing, manufacturing, and digital services? Then the second question is, you spoke about the potential $3.4 trillion market space. Which sector is the largest from that, or if you came across anything of that nature?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. I didn't get the name. From South Africa. Oh, yeah, South Africa. I usually love the country. Yes, thank you. Starting with the last one, I think the last one was on which sector. Best from the Ugandan case, agriculture still is agro-processing is still a sector that takes in quite a number of young people. You don't need a bachelor's degree for that one. They just join immediately. So it's still agro-processing that I think absorbs. I think the bigger majority of sub-Saharan Africa and also maybe West Africa is still agro-processing, because the other sectors are really high-level sectors that requires billions of dollars to be able to engage in. If you talk of, multilateral corporations, especially manufacturing, pharmaceutical, one of the key areas, really big operations. But the low-hanging one is agro-business, agro-processing. That's one that is really absorbing very many people. Yeah. And the other, of course, looking at the skill, you're asking the skilling rate. How many are getting in? Taken in? From nothing to something. Yeah, it's really low, very low. If you look at the non-employment education and training ratio, is very low. And looking at it's high compared to those who are actually going through the business trainings and vocational training centers. So that's why you see we are trying as much to see, not only in Uganda, but across the African continent. Besides, North Africa is doing quite better. North Africa is doing quite better. But sub-Saharan Africa is where the challenge still is, where governments have not really adopted, have not really, let me say, naturalized everything to do with vocational training, so that even if you don't go to university, you still have a skill that can earn you. So that is not yet there. So the rates are low. They are still high. Those ones who are not in school, not in employment, not in training are very high. So the rate is like about 1.5 being absorbed out of a population of about, in Uganda, the population of young people is remember, the population is about 50 right now, but 75% is young, and you're taking about 1.5. You can now imagine how many are left out. And that's why you see in East Africa alone, there is seriously unrest there because of that. But if the absorption rate to these technicals are high, you would see the change. You would definitely see the change, but the change is not there. And that's why we are calling in private sector and government to join hands to ensure that we raise up that number. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. And I have questions for both of you. First, I want you to comment on your thoughts around having one protocol that addresses women and youth together, especially because these are two different people groups with two different needs, but somewhere in the wisdom of the drafters, they thought it was a good idea to lump these two different groups in one protocol. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Secondly, still connected to that, do you think there would now be any difference in terms of implementation now that they are both in the same protocol? What would the dynamics look like in terms of implementation? And then again, off the back of that, do you think the AfCFTA had women considerations as an afterthought? Do you think that the strategy that they've taken to create a separate protocol is effective versus integrating gender issues from the beginning? Some people of the school of thought that, yes, it's better to have a separate protocol addressing women, while there's another school of thought that says issues around women shouldn't have a separate protocol, it should be ingrained. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. And then finally, just generally your thoughts about how we can move forward in terms of steps. Again, like in the former session, I always want to know, what am I taking away from here? What can I do from where I am to make sure that we're moving forward, in the direction of this big ambition that we have? What are your recommendations on what we can start to do as people here now? Thank you.
I think we should take all the questions and then have the speakers answer all the questions. Are there any more questions? I have one of my own. Okay, I'll go last.
Hi, this is for you, Doc. My name is Tusa. I'm a student at the University of Johannesburg. So you mentioned that entrepreneurship is not the only way that youth can be involved. I just wanted to ask you to please elaborate on the other ways that I can be involved as a young person in, that's the question.
Good day, everyone. My name is Tabisile Similani from the Gauteng Department of Economic Development. So from a woman point of view in government, I'd like to know how the government can play a role, because policy making and all of that starts with us. So I would like to know what can be other things that they can, talks like this that can happen to actually push all the involved people, whether it's trade or industrialization or just focusing on infrastructure, that will help the women and the youth get to a point where we don't feel as marginalized as we feel right now to enter into the job market. Thank you.
And we have one question from someone online. They're asking if women and youth were to be introduced to new and high value markets like the green circular economy, carbon markets, would implementations boost economic inclusion for both groups? It's not specific to any speaker. Do we have any more questions on the floor? The question is, if women and youth were to be introduced to new and high value markets like the green circular economy, carbon markets, and so forth, wouldn't such implementations boost economic inclusion for both groups?
I just wanted to pose the same question I posed in the previous round against the backdrop of youth-focused initiatives, specifically on the continent, always having gaps, even more so than any. Is the AfCFTA a good instrument, just from both speakers, or is it something that we have now and we have to make it work? Because it kind of feels, especially when it comes to youth and women, and this touches to your comments, a little bit like an afterthought. And we have many, many examples from the continent that are even tied to Agenda 2063, where we are failing to do what we need to do, yet there are so many policy recommendations. So is this the right way? And if not, what is the alternative?
Okay, do we have any more questions, or can I ask my question? Okay, I have a question for Emolot on agro-processing. I just wanted to ask, what would it take for Uganda to move from exporting raw commodities to value-added processing at scale? I asked this question because in the last session, one of the speakers talked about how the concept of a value chain is often applied to more advanced value chains where women already have access to finance and the relevant infrastructure. So if we're saying that we're going to introduce agro-processing in and of itself involves, a value addition along the agricultural process. So what would it take for Uganda to move from exporting raw commodities to value-added processing at scale? Yeah, I think the speakers can answer the questions now.
Okay, I'm menopausal. Those are a lot of questions. So let me see if I can remember them all. I've tried to note it as best as possible. The question of a woman protocol, a youth protocol, separate or not. I don't know. I don't know if that's really the debate. For me, substantively, what is the change we want to see? We've seen incidences where we've had specific protocols or frameworks that's specifically around gender-responsive budgeting frameworks, etc., gender mainstreaming, but not yielded what we wanted. We get stuck in the language of the frameworks as opposed to saying, what is it that we want to achieve and what is it that we need to do a bit differently to shift? It's really power dynamics that we're needing to shift. So I don't personally want to get involved in a debate about youth only, women only, both. I don't think that's a helpful conversation. And there are, I've said enough on that. And then with implementation, again, is who are involving in the implementation process? Is it those who are most affected? How are we involving people? How are we listening? What are the questions we need to ask? Because the bugbear I have with frameworks is we adopt them as though they are the absolute that we must abide by, yet we say our contexts are unique. So where do we find the flexibility to understand the uniqueness of the context, use the framework as a guide to lift the questions that we need to lift to respond to something in the context? So, and implementation is hard. I'm not going to have an easy answer. And there isn't an easy answer because there's so much diversity, but it does mean that we need to think carefully about who needs to be involved. And it's not a responsibility of that one or that one or that one. We also have to say, given the hat I wear and the role I play, what is my responsibility? And can I also stop waiting for someone else to effect that change? And I think that was our push around solidarity. If we want something different, we're going to get different when we make sure we're part of making the difference we want. It's not going to come easy. How can government play a role? You're in government, organize a meeting, pull together people, get the people. That's really what's going to have to happen. Because from an academic institution, for me to call a meeting of government officials, what clout do I have? You in the system, you understand it, you think through who are the allies in your system, who are other young people in your system who are a bit dissatisfied with the bureaucracy, but see it as an opportunity. Get them together, organize, build a movement, build solidarity, then think who's outside of our allies. I think our problem is we wait for somebody else to do that. And I say this not glibly because we're all stretched with our work pressures, our life pressures and that. But change is not going to happen when we're waiting for somebody else, right? So that's a blunt kind of response. I have, sorry. And then there was a question online. I mean, I don't know. I can't claim to have, I'm not even a trade specialist. I work on social policy predominantly. I'm assuming that if we think through the ways in which we have to engage with climate change and moving towards green thinking around green manufacturing, I think we need to say what are ways in which we can ensure those are always on the margins in whatever shape and form. How do we make sure there's inclusivity? So I think that will benefit. I know there's the whole debate around carbon markets, etc. I'm not well versed, but I don't just like to adopt the terminology and language and say, yes, I think we must interrogate that. And then what is this a good instrument? Well, I don't know. It's as good as we're going to make it. I mean, I think in my view, it's built and it's expressing a vision that comes from many years ago of visionary African thinkers. You know, it's a Pan-African vision. And if it's something you believe in, then, you know, we need to make it realize and make it happen. The environment which we're in now is very different to when those ideas percolated in the circumstances in which they percolated. So we need to think about how we make it happen. Do I have the answer? I'm sorry, no, I don't have that. But I think we need to think, who do we need to rally around to sort of help think through these things? Because it's only in the rethinking, the reanalysis, is the potential to find ways forward feasible. Okay, I think I'm sorry, yeah, we have 10 minutes. You already have
Okay, let me start. 2 minutes. 10 minutes. Oh, okay. Yes, and thank you. I think Doctor said it. Whether or not the women or the youth were an afterthought, I think where we are now, it's just important to be like, okay, what do we have? What can we move with already? Because if we go back to ground zero, whether or not we were thought later, that's how I used to be. I also used to be very bitter. I was youth were thought later, because actually when they were negotiating the protocol, it was only the protocol of women in trade. It wasn't the protocol of women and youth in trade. So the women had gone ahead. So we were bitter and we're like, no, how can it be? But eventually the youth came in. But the idea now is, can we work with what is there? Already the protocol as it is actually a very beautiful protocol. I should say we worked on it. We're in Durban here. We sat for days working on this protocol. And we thought we had closed every gap that we think we should be closed. And Doctor did an amazing, this presentation, I'll go with it, did an amazing job with the presentation. Got some perspectives we didn't even see, but the protocol itself is there. It's really an amazing protocol. So the idea now is not to cry foul, but rather to see what can we capitalize with what we have. That's what really now matters. And the challenge now we are discussing the protocol when the AfCFTA already is under review. 5 years have passed. We do review of the AfCFTA every after 5 years. So we're already reviewing the AfCFTA, and yet the protocol was just adopted last year by the heads of states. So you see the challenges we're having. It feels bad. And I always love saying that women and youth, I love using the term, there's a structural exclusion of women and youth in the space. Structure. They know we exist. They know we are the bigger majority, especially for the women in informal cross-border trade. Everyone knows that the bigger majority, but there's a structural exclusion. But as the advocates within the space, we always try to get a window. When we get a window, we capitalize on it. We forget that we're crying. We now have a protocol that we can flag. And we have all the courts. We have so if they fail, we'll be like, no, you assented to this. Most of you have ratified this. Of course, now there's a debate of whether or not you've signed the other protocol. Does it mean you've ratified? We are now back to that drama again. but we shall overcome. When we overcome, we shall have this protocol to flag and be like, no, 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 you are accepted. And that is the weapon we have now. We have now stopped going to the streets. We are now using the same tactics. They close us from the papers. We have now known. And that's why we were very intentional at ensuring we co-create this. So separation doesn't, whether or not they are separated, it still achieves the same purpose. Where we are now, the protocol actually achieves the same purpose. Women are protected, the youth are protected. So the goal is now to see policy action for you would be to actually understand it. Doctor should give you the slides, to just go and understand it and move with it. The moment it becomes like gospel truth for youth in trade, if you really want to champion youth and women interests, the protocol is the vehicle. You understand it. National AfCFTA implementation committees are the vehicle at member state level. They have what we call the National AfCFTA implementation strategy. Every government have. If you're from Nigeria, the Nigerian even got a $2 million grant from UNDP, I believe, to actually implement the AfCFTA. So they don't have an excuse of no money. They have the money. So it's just to be like, okay, what are you doing? What are you doing? What South Africa here is also now part of the guided trade initiative. They launched shipments last year. So no one has an excuse now. It's us now to be like, okay, what can we go and advocate for? So yeah, the protocol is all encompassing, and I don't see any problem whether they're divided or not. It still helps us achieve the clauses in it, help us achieve the goal that we intend to achieve. Quickly on the, I think I've mentioned that that was really I think I was also like you, the biggest animal. But the other question was introducing young people. Would it boost implementation if young people are introduced in the new economies or new opportunities or markets like blue economy, carbon, and whatnot? I believe yes. It's a locked place, and I definitely believe it would be amazing if young people can also get in those that, since it's mainly regulated to big multilateral companies, it would be good. But the entry points is where we would need to. Then, I definitely believe it would be a good inclusion. It would be a big boost. Second last would be, again, a good instrument. When it comes to youth, they seem to, like they are always an afterthought. I totally agree. Again, I've mentioned, same point, structural exclusion. They always seem as an afterthought, but they always remember. Eventually, they go and knock. The Kenyans have showed you people that you can choose your cabinet, but when we will come for you. And it is something. So they always remember. Yes, AfCFTA, youth, women, we still have issues. I'm happy there is a women advisory council. The women are actually very proactive. They have a women advisory council. The youth, we are still, apart from us, the council, there's no continental council yet, and we are still pushing for that to see that we also achieve that council at the continental, where different young people, not only us, but in different other sectors, academia, NGO, all come together to provide ideas in the process. Then lastly would be my take on Uganda. Actually, yes, not only Uganda. You saw Burkina Faso with the young Captain Traore doing that, locking no raw materials export. President Museveni, His Excellency, has actually been so serious at ensuring that that goods are modified, the value added in the country, then you export. If they can't, Japanese farms have been forced to establish plants in the country. So right now, the government is like, you want to invest in our raw material, you want to harvest our raw materials, establish plants here. So most of them are actually doing that in the country. And I think that is the best way to go. Most of them are actually then be able to adopting. Then lastly, I'm not going to add, is just to thank my good friend Angisa here. You stand up. She's a beautiful woman. Yeah. You let them see you. Let them see you. Let them see you. And why I'm thanking her is because she actually then who notified me about the tips that there are actually papers that you could actually submit. So if the call to action, someone was asking me about the call to action. If we have friends like her who notify you that there is something, this is what Africa wants. Africa needs young people who take up this info. Now, us in the room, we now have the AfCFTA. Doctor has done an amazing job with the protocol of women and youth in trade. I've also told you my part. So with this knowledge you've had, we're asking about practical steps is for you to move with this message and go to wherever you're going and advocate. That is the only way we shall actually cause change. Short of that, it will be a disaster. But you also need to be, as my good friend here, when you also announce to other people, there's an opportunity in South Africa, do it. Asante. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take us home, Marisanang.
No, I'll just keep it quick. And it's in response to what are the different job opportunities that you may find in this space. And I think we can't think about trade in isolation. Now we need to think about trade and sustainability together. So I think 3 things for me when you're trying to be in the spaces to think about people, policy, and the planet. With people, you find your entrepreneurs, your firms, and your researchers. And those are options when you're looking in the trade space. In policy, you have people working in government affairs here because governments are involved in the negotiations. You have people developing industrial policy that needs to be implemented. And when it comes to the AfCFTA, if you may know, in the textile space, they're currently negotiating the rules of origin, and you need experts to know what components are important, what are the type of trade-offs that you want to let go of, or the concessions that you must make, and you need experts in that field. And then when it comes to the planet, a lot of funding is going to mitigation, and we need people to think about what are certain ways to think about adaptation in this space. We have DFIs now, your African Bank and your AFDB. We have regional integration divisions where you can look for opportunities there. So I think if you're the people side, the policy side, and the planet, you will find something in that space.
Thank you so much to our amazing speakers for such an enriching session. Yeah, that concludes our session on advancing youth and gender in the AFC something. It's been a long day, guys. Anyway, thanks everybody for staying until the end. We are on time with 2 minutes to spare. So thank you so much. Have an amazing afternoon. Thanks.